Hello, good afternoon. Jorle, everyone. On behalf of International Funders for Indigenous Peoples, IFIP, I'd like to warmly welcome you all to our session centering First Nations leadership, unlocking climate finance for First Nations-led climate solution. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Chanda Thapa Mogar, Mogar Indigenous Peoples from Nepal, and I work with IFIP as a program director. And it is an honor to open this important session today alongside with my friends from Australia, Larissa, and we're our esteemed panelists here. IFIP is excited to host this important conversation at this time at the Australian Pavilion. This is actually the first time we are hosting here in Australian Pavilion to really elevate the First Nation leadership dialogue on equitable climate finance. So for just a little bit about IFIP, those who don't know about it, International Funders for Indigenous Peoples, IFIP is a global funders of network dedicated to foster partnership between Indigenous peoples organizations and funders communities globally. For over two decades, IFIP has been advocating for shifting power, mobilizing direct resources to Indigenous peoples, and strengthening partnerships that amplify Indigenous leadership and self-determination. That's where we are. And IFIP's work is guided by the 5 R's framework, which we call Indigenous philanthropy, 5R of Indigenous philanthropy: respect, relationship, responsibility, reciprocity, and redistribution. And we always encourage IFIP members, which is a community of more than 60 funders, private foundation, public foundation, and also Indigenous-led funds who are part of IFIP larger community. So with the establishment of the IFIP Australia group in 2023, which is an expansion of IFIP's work in the region, it has deepened its engagement with First Nations communities and philanthropy partners in Australia. So this conversation today will also be helping us to dive deeper into the current context in Australia, hearing from our Indigenous leaders and also from funders practice. We will just look into the climate finance and the resource mobilization that is going to Indigenous peoples is very, very less, whether it's be at the global level or at the regional level or country level. So I think this current climate finance system too often fail to reflect Indigenous values to enable direct, adequate, and equitable finance access for the Indigenous communities. So yes, it's my great pleasure to invite our moderator, Larissa Baldwin-Roberts, to lead today's discussion. Larissa is a leading voice in climate justice and the First Nations advocacy in Australia. She's the co-founder of Common Threads, an Indigenous organization focused on transforming the capability of First Nations movements to usher in systems change through Indigenous approaches to campaigning and self-determination, centering around First Nations power, sovereignty, and climate action. So we are very much excited for this conversation. Look forward to more deeper conversation with the panel today. Thank you, Larissa. Over to you.
Thank you, Chanda. Can you all hear me? This is close enough? Okay. So I am going to introduce our incredible panel. I asked them if they want to do it themselves, and they said, no, you do it, so I'm going to do it. But we have here San Murray. She's a deadly Yilka, Wunga, and Noongar woman from desert country. She's the Indigenous Desert Alliance first Indigenous CEO from the desert and works passionately ensuring that Indigenous rangers are enabled to collaboratively manage the Australian desert and empowered to realise their aspirations, community, culture and country. I also have Joe Featherstone, who is a poet and the previous CEO and co-founder of the Red Room Poetry. Joe is the chair of Oranges and Sardines Foundation, and with Uncle George runs the Paddock. And then lastly on our panel, and not least, is Uncle George. He is many things, including a trained counsellor, youth justice coordinator, cultural heritage advisor. He runs the Paddock, a space for dreaming, a place for centering of way of working in common unity with the community on Mulunjali country. So this is our incredible panel. Make them feel welcome, everybody. Let's get my questions. Hang on a minute. So I do want to start this yarn off with just a bit of a caveat that we're going to be talking a lot about climate and a lot about climate finance. And to be fair, a lot of our mob don't think about climate when they're talking about the work that they do and the work that they do for country. They don't see it through a lens of just purely climate. It is part of our culture and our responsibility to look after country. So climate is one part of the work that we do, but holistically the work that we do around looking after country. So Indigenous strategies, and I say this a lot, as Indigenous peoples, our cultures are inherently mitigation and adaptation strategies. So really the answer is us as Indigenous peoples. But I also want to say on climate finance, a lot of people, we have a big delegation of mob here in these couple of weeks, and a lot of people ask this question, like, what is climate finance? The reality is, in the developed and developing country, there's this big tug of war around who gets this big investment, where it comes from. There aren't a lot of mechanisms in Australia within our region to access these types of things. And so there's public funding that can come from governments, some money that can come from philanthropy, but really what we think of is like, how do we resource the work that we do on country? And I guess that's the way I just want to frame up this debate, because these are not necessarily terms that we throw around on country back home. So my opening question to the panel, and I might start with you, Sam, but I'm going to pass this to everyone. From your perspective, community, philanthropy or land-based leadership, what does unlocking climate finance for First Nations-led community climate solutions look like?
Thanks, Larissa. First and foremost, it's having access to that. Being a desert person myself and advocating for some of the most remote communities in Australia, in the middle of Australia, accessibility to get finance and support directly to the ground, to the mob who are caring for country day in, day out, is the number one priority for us. Accessibility and elevation of the work they do.
Hello? Yeah, can you hear me okay? It's hard. I mean, Larissa, you said what I really wanted to say too, which is I have no idea really what climate finance actually means, and it can't be one thing. And before this, I was looking up what actually the word finance means, and this idea that finance, once upon a time, actually was this weird French word that is around the settling of a debt, like the end. And for me, when we're talking about these sorts of things like climate finance, it's nothing about the end. It's all about like the beginning and the opportunity. So for me, and the work that George and I do, when you think about climate finance, it's everything. Like, it's not like a tree goes around thinking about money or making profit, nor do the stars, nor necessarily do the community that we work with. It's a really holistic approach. So you can't talk about climate finance on its own without thinking about a community or the people that we're there to work alongside with. I think that's really, really important.
I think to cut it short, most simplest part for any community is starting to use language that we understand. Climate finance is not one of them. It doesn't come in any part of any community that I've been to. So for me to have an understanding about stuff, I need to understand what it is. And climate finance is not one of those things. So again, using the words that we understand might help. That's just a personal opinion.
Thank you. So I might go to you next, Sam. You talk about the barriers around climate finances, and I know you speak like under the IDA and the work that you do is such a large portion of country that you're supporting mob on to protect. But what are the barriers that predominantly like prevent our mob from reaching the kind of finance that they require? But also, what impact does that have around climate resilience on the ground? And also, if you're able, this is a bigger question, but if you're able to overcome those barriers, like what opportunities do you see if there is actual real finance reaching these communities?
Yeah, so, rangers out there, we practically know what solutions we need. Rangers go out there every day, they're monitoring the animals, they're doing the fire practice, they're out there managing and threatened, invasive species like buffelgrass, and then protecting threatened species. So for rangers and desert people, we know the climate has changed because we see it, and desert people are the most impacted Aboriginal people in Australia, along with our Islander brothers and sisters. we know the impacts. It's very obvious. We see country change. So I always elevate that desert people will often gets forgotten that we are the most impacted people for climate change in Australia, along with our islander brothers and sisters. So for us, it isn't so much a holistic thing because rangers see it every day over decades what the changes are. They're going to the same sacred sites and special places and that. So in terms of barriers, it's most of those ranger teams are only funded by government funding. Philanthropy doesn't get out to the middle of Australia as much as it does for the urban areas, and there's not a lot of mining in the middle of Australia. So you have a core group of people who are working really, really hard to protect the middle of Australia, which 1/3 of Australia is considered desert country, and funding. We're completely reliant on government funding, and philanthropy money doesn't just get out there, and those opportunities don't get out there. So for us, those barriers are really quite big, strong barriers. It's funding and it's elevation about what desert rangers are doing, and just recognising that, we are the most impacted Aboriginal people in Australia alongside our islander brothers and sisters as well. So those are the barriers, is recognition. If you were to ask anyone in Australia, where's climate change impacted the most, the Great Barrier Reef always pops up, rising waters always pops up, but very rarely you hear people say, oh, the middle of Australia, high temperatures, them fellas are suffering the most, which we are. So I think just more awareness, more access to funding, and also being in the middle of Australia and so remote, very rarely do desert people get to be at the tables to make those and support those decisions. So making sure we have desert representation at those policy-making tables is really important, considering we're very, very impacted by climate change out there.
Just to follow up, because I'm sure that there is barely anyone here who has actually been out to desert country. I think there is a lot of misconceptions around, like, well, desert's just out there and it doesn't require managing. Like, what are the types of misconceptions, or, like, what are desert rangers doing? Like, I feel like there's not a lot of people would understand the type of work that people are doing out there on country.
So I think for, as all First Nations people, we care for country in all of our ways across the world. And that's a given. Like, I think you could go to every First Nation group in Australia and internationally. We all raised to care for the environment that we're in, and that holds the stories. Desert rangers are out there working hard on those things like the threatened species, the applying fire to the country, protecting against invasive species like buffalo grass and feral cats and camel. So desert rangers are rolling out the work every day in terms of caring for the country and carrying on culture. And they just hold so many bigger cultural responsibilities in the community as leaders. They're first responders to wildfires and flooding and those natural disasters which have been enhanced by climate change. So they're usually the first responders when that's happening, and the first people that are leading climate mitigation practices out there as well. So in a way, we're like, the underachievers that are working really hard out there in the middle of Australia, and not much is known. And I think someone gave a fact the other day that we've had fire burning out in the desert that I think, clips like the Amazon size and burning. And because it's burning not near mansions or wealthy places or, tourist landmarks in Australia, it's kind of not known. So there could be hundreds of kilometres burnt and out of control by wildfires, but no one knows or cares because it's not burning down mansions or it's not the Opera House. So very proud desert ranger person and supporter to go. There's a whole group of people out there working very, very hard to keep the bilby alive, to keep the great desert skink alive, and we're just doing our business.
Thank you. I'm going to go to you next, Joe. So people talk a lot about philanthropy having the flexibility to do what governments cannot. I would say that the government still has a lot of obligation to our people in the way that they support or move funding towards us in terms of reparations. But what internal shifts are required for philanthropy to align with Indigenous values and truly support climate leadership from First Nations people?
It's a lot in that question. And I'm still thinking about the bilby. Yeah. It's hard to go answer that question when you just talk about bilby. I don't know how familiar everyone is really with the whole world of philanthropy.
Hold up that.
How everyone is familiar with the world of philanthropy. So I guess I just say that this is my definition and my experience of philanthropy in response to that question. And also, Larissa, you asked about, how does it align with Indigenous values? Well, I can't necessarily say what all the world's Indigenous values are, but I can certainly share with you the things that I think are problematic in philanthropy. But again, I think one of the main barriers is around language. Like even the word barrier is like there's no changing. Whereas for me, the fact there's so many things wrong with philanthropy is a really extraordinary opportunity to be able to change it. And I think a lot of the things are really obvious in terms of what's wrong with philanthropy. One is the language itself. It's often inaccessible. It's often colonial. No one has a singular shared definition of philanthropy. So we all talk about philanthropy, but not one person in this room is going to have the same version. So mine is something along the lines of sharing what you have, in all sorts of different ways. And people around the world have been doing that for thousands of years. In this specific context where we're talking about money, then obviously philanthropy can be active in how do you shift the resources from big institutions to local communities. And one way, and one obvious way to do that is to take risks, enjoy it, like make it something fun, which I think is missing all the time from these conversations, but also is to have conversations and build relationships with the people and the communities that you're working with, whether that's friendships, that begins small but can go long. And so I think one of the big barriers is people's misconception around the idea that things have to end, or things have to be in 1 year or 3-year blocks or 5-year blocks. Like for me, I'm interested in the long story. Like why does there have to be an end date as to when you support or are involved or have partnerships with anybody, whether it's community, whether it's a person, whether it's a tree or a place or a bilby. Like I'm being really serious in that these are just ridiculous things that I think philanthropy has to really break open. It should be this open-hearted conversation with people. And so on that, I'd like to maybe hand it over to George, because one of the things to answer that question is actually about the work we do at the paddock, which didn't really begin in any way with the idea of philanthropy. In that sense, the idea of money or someone asking for money or help or support or someone going in and saying, I've got something to give, just wasn't the beginning. So the barrier of having a shit foundation from which to build a relationship wasn't there. It just sort of sprung up organically. And for me, that's like an extraordinary example of what you can do when there's all sorts of things aligning that you don't really know what's at work, and you just go into something not knowing what's going to happen. To me, that's something that philanthropy can do, and government obviously can't have that magic.
No.
I think to put things in perspective is that where we met Joe was on a property, and the part from the conversation was around our Indigenous communities. The biggest thing about what we believe in is the unity. There's a common unity in it. It is a common understanding of it. Where we are, we're the Maranjali people, but they also got the Yugambeh Land Enterprise, and we got the paddock. Every single thing that we know of, that everyone goes for funding to the government and make all of us fight against each other for that same money. So we decided to get together with both Maranjali Housing Development Company, Yugambeh Land Enterprise, and make a pact between the three of us on how we can actually approach any problem that actually comes up. Just from that first meeting, we all decided that the concentration would be with the Yugambeh Land Enterprise, which my nephew runs. And it's a 1,000 acres that was under caveat and still is under caveat. So using the different parts of philanthropy, rather than giving money straight out, what was needed to actually get that going. And the simplest part about that was to stop the government caveats. The government had that many processes around it that Yugambeh Land Enterprise couldn't make a business. You weren't allowed. You can have the land, but you can't make a business out of it. So as a group, we got together with Joe. And again, philanthropy isn't money. what happened in this particular sense was Joe used her contacts to get a legal firm to actually come out and start talking for us, because every time you go to court, 95% of the time you're going to get locked up or something. But this just isn't the case. This was a good outcome where that particular legal process allowed Yugambeh Land Enterprise to start planning to stand on its own 2 feet. So that's where this particular partnership can actually grow in so many ways. And I advise any philanthropist to come and have a yarn with Joe to find out what that actually means.
And then in terms of like starting something from a relationship versus, you know, a lot of philanthropy or even financial mechanisms will require you to tick so many boxes.
Yeah.
What's your strategy? How are you going to do this? What's the capacity? How many people do you have hired? Can you talk about the experience as a community leader actually setting out that relationship and building towards something? Like how is it, how it's different from government, I guess, but also why it's important?
Community, it's a common unity. It's in the word, common unity. The part around that particular word is that people throw it aside and they don't put any action in to make what we're all up against a common thing. So that's what we need to do. It's not that I know all the answers, that's far from it. Is that I know we know what needs to be done, but we don't have the skill set, such in the legal field, where that's where Joe's skill set is. And the unity of where Joe and where my community's from is that partnership. We're lucky enough to have a person who actually understands that we know what we want, but we don't have the finance nor the skill set to gain where that is. And that's the beauty. It's just like having a house. You know, if the lights go out, you won't be calling a plumber. You need a certain thing. You need an electrician. That's what this partnership actually helps with. It's not that we're silly. It's just we don't have that skill set. That's all that means.
Thank you. Sam, do you want to reflect on as well what it, like, meaningful partnerships in order to bring philanthropy into across Desert? Like, what does it look like? Is it similar? Is it different? I know there's a lot of it, or maybe what the experience of bringing government to the table.
I really liked what Uncle George was saying about, you know, recognising the different skill sets and coming together as a partnership to get an outcome. And I think applying it to our lens in terms of Indigenous land management, you know, rangers are great with 2A science. They know how to work with ecologists. They know how to work with linguists. You know, rangers are actually, I mean, I'm incredibly biased, obviously, with rangers and desert mobs. So I do preface that as well. But desert rangers and ranger teams in general in Australia are just fantastic at understanding and appreciating knowledge, because I think at heart Aboriginal people know and respect knowledge. And so with rangers recognising and working with ecologists and scientists and those from mainstream Western, you know, fields, if there's an openness and going, well, we want to work together to bring our knowledges together and support the bilby so that it you know, is still around for the next generation. But that comes with a real needing to respect that there are probably different ways of thinking and different approaches, and that you can't translate one from the other. And at times I think there's a forcing of that too. So I think recognising the partnership, recognising different skill sets, and making sure that, you know, Indigenous knowledges are at least the same level and even further appreciated in the equation, and leading that partnership. Aboriginal people, and like I said, rangers, are really good at working in partnership with different knowledges. If Aboriginal people are given the opportunity to lead that conversation, because we really, I think, at heart appreciate different knowledge ways of thinking, and very open to learning. You know, I had an experience where I had a whole nana, you know, come into the office the other day, and she's yarning to the young fella who, last time she was up in a helicopter with him doing fire burning, and she's like 65. And she was telling this young fire officer in the team, saying, nah, when you're coming out again, I want to go again up in the helicopter. So I just think, you know, really letting Aboriginal people guide that, because we already know how to bring it all together and recognise different skill sets. So I think letting Aboriginal people guide that process is going to be a really good way for success for bringing different knowledges together, because we need both knowledges to hit our outcome. We can't do it on our own.
Joe, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we have been doing in setting up at Common Threads is an Indigenous-led fund, which is about redistribution and trying to help philanthropy move more money into First Nations communities at a grassroots level, at a community level. One of the things I find when we have conversations with the big global funds is that, oh, Australia is a very wealthy place, and people think that they think of the Pacific as the small island nations, and they don't think about our communities from a global philanthropic perspective. But also, they think the country is very wealthy. There's a very well-established philanthropy. There was a report that was released by Philanthropy Australia that said something like 0.9% of funding from philanthropy goes to First Nations people, and of that, what directly goes to actually our initiatives. What do you think Australian philanthropy needs to do, or what are the conversations that you have in that space around helping people on the journey around more investment? Just talk about what that journey looks like at the moment, because we are trying to move Australian philanthropy, and we need to get there in order to get the type of investment that we see across country.
Well, a lot of the time I feel like I try to run away from those spaces and conversations, but then have to go back into them. There's so many reasons, so there's not just one reason, and I think it really, Larissa, it depends on who you talk to. There's still this deep-seated racist something that underlies people who are unsure, nervous, don't want to support First Nations-led and owned organisations. And those conversations come out in a variety of different ways. Sometimes obvious statements that you're appalled by, other times they're mysterious suggestions or mistrusts. And so in those conversations for myself, it's just constantly facing those questions based on the reality. And that reality is my experience, which has never been anything but extraordinary people that I've worked with. So I can only ever talk to my experience. And I think one of the challenges is that people won't have experiences. People in Australia seem to be frightened of having conversations with people and having frightening conversations where they're often challenged or have to think another way. I think that's part of it. I think the other part is there's still this real push to divide people all the time. So you're a philanthropist, you're a donor, you're a funder, you're a recipient, you're from this community, you're not from that community. There seems to be this wedge all the time that's placed, which I think makes it difficult for philanthropy to move forward, because even philanthropists are put in boxes as well. So there's got to be some sort of opening up. And I think money brings power and control, and people love it. I mean, people fucking love control, and they love money, and they want to keep it no matter what they say. So Australia is a rich country, and a lot of people have excess money, but they don't necessarily share it, or they still share it with things that they're passionate about and don't necessarily have a great devotion to thinking beyond that, because one of the challenges with philanthropy is it's not accountable really to many things apart from the person whose money it is. So philanthropy or philanthropic organisations have to invent their own version of accountability, which is pretty dangerous. And so I think that's one of the really big shifts in philanthropy is who is everyone accountable to? Is it your board? But even if it's the board, most likely the board of a foundation is going to have family members, or, it's complex. So I think the system itself has to change. And likewise, my last point is that we've got to just shift this definition of philanthropy. I mean, I think we've even got to stop using the word, which is sort of ridiculous. I mean, again, the roots of these words comes, for the love of humankind, but we're talking about climate and nature, and what about the bilbies? So much has to shift. That's just some of the things that I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess I might start this question with you. Next question, Uncle George, and I'll go to the whole panel. But when we think about, I see a lot of the way in the way that you talk about the story and the work that you do around how you lead with our values up front. But if you were to take some of those values and I guess embed them into these financial systems, or embed them into philanthropy, or the relationship that we have with resourcing, so I don't know, we just want to say money, but resourcing our communities. What do you think are important Indigenous values for these spaces to take on?
I think, again, it's just being common. Find something that unifies everyone. In all the conversations I've heard so far, there's always been more distance between the problem. I think, like we worked out the most simplest thing. What do we need? We need to be together. That's the first thing. Then, how do you get together? Why are you getting together for? The harder part about it is everyone's right to their opinion, but to have a working solution in progress, you've got to combine. All of us have the knowledge, and that's Indigenous, non-Indigenous. You don't care where you come from. Everyone has a gift. So focus on the gifts, don't focus on what you can't do. I think that's the easiest way of putting it.
And Sam?
I think recognising that, communities have very clear cultural goals and indicators that they want achieved. And I think, when you talk about like philanthropy and funders and supporters, it's a question whether or not they genuinely want to support First Nations people on the ground, or they have their own goal that they're trying to achieve. Because a lot of people, with our mobs, with ranger teams, they're very clear about where they want that funding support. They're very clear about what cultural outcomes they want. They're very clear about the culture indicators that prove that those goals are getting hit. So we're very clear about what we want and very clear in a practical sense of what we need. And so when people come to the party, and we work with philanthropy a lot as well, it's, are you prepared to accept and back and fund this very clear goal, cultural goals and indicators that this ranger team want? And then it's a dialogue and a negotiation. But I think recognising that we kind of have a very clear goal already what we want. And then it's like, are you going to support us to achieve that or not? And some people will walk out the door quite easily because they can't. And there's even room for making space about recognising that there's other outcomes. I mean, all the ranger teams are funded to maybe look after a particular bird, but the old fellas on the trip want to go and look at an old special place they were born. Now you're not going to find that outcome in the funding application or environmental funding. But there's a recognition that old fella know, well, we'll go the long way around, see my special place, and I'll tell you where the birds are. So, I mean, Aboriginal people are very adaptable. We're very, very aware of how the world works. So I think it's finding space for making sure that the cultural goals are there, and then there is space for those other goals, because we get it as well. It may not be completely funding one way. It has to probably be some room where there's some goals that organisation might need to hit as well. But it's about being really honest about those goals and indicators, and then being the philanthropy and funders being really honest and really, are they really committing to back First Nations what they want? Because we know what we want. We know what we need. We know what we practically think. You go to any ranger team in the middle of Australia, they'll know exactly where they need their funding and exactly what it's going to do to what particular bird and animal or plant. They know what they need for their ranger team. They know exactly what they need, and it's like the support has to come.
I think the other thing, just to add my 2 cents in, but when I talked to Mob about philanthropy, like I remember having, we had nearly 200 Mob up in Gimoy and Cairns, and we had the Common Thread Summit, and, we had all these big conversations and discussions, and one of the conversations that came from the floor was like, where did you get the money to do this thing? And we were just like, did you get this from government? We said, no. Did you get it from mining? No. And just like explaining this idea around philanthropy, but our mob don't even know what the word philanthropy is. Like, what do you mean? Like, where there's people that are out there just giving their money, or and like, well, it's not. Like, I wish it was like that. But I think there is part of the work of like, we are if you think about philanthropy and Indigenous cultures and the idea around reciprocity, like we are the most giving people to our own people, and I think for our communities, what I love, and I think it's within some of the stuff that you're saying as well, Sam, is like, our mob just get on with the job. Like, whether you're going to get funded for it or not get funded for it, you'll find a way to make it happen. Like, we've been filled with so many stories, like, of different ranges, especially with the big mega fires that have been happening within Australia. Like, there's different laws at different times during big fires around whether or not you can do burns and back burning. But when you're protecting sacred places, those ranger groups and having them out on country, like, they will just go out and do the back burning that needs to happen because that site needs to be protected. And like, obviously there's legislation that needs to happen and change and giving our communities access in so many different ways, but just that adaptability, that ability to get it done, roll up your sleeves, like not ask for permission. I think like if philanthropy could kind of take that on a little bit more and just be like, let's see where this is going to go, let's do what needs to be done, and that would be a much better approach. I want to, this next question is kind of like what philanthropy looks like between Indigenous leadership and philanthropy. But I also want to say within this, like, just to explain, because the barriers within government funding as well and the cycles of government funding is very similar to what we see in climate at a kind of global level. And maybe just like either of you want to unpack what that experience is like. Like, it doesn't have to be like, here's all the war stories, but how could this system be better?
I think for us, like we've been pushing and saying, you know, obviously cultural resilience is climate resilience, meaning you let First Nations mob care for country and continue the way that they approach it, and then you back that, and then that by default is climate resilience. It's about making sure that those groups are able to deal with being adaptable with climate change, making them more climate resilient, so giving the support they need. And again, we know what that means. So it's just finding the right funding support, to be honest, and making sure that climate resilient outcomes and goals that we have, which we already know, can be funded and supported. And again, it's about the alignment between what's in the climate finance world, what is perceived as funding that's for particular things. So for us, it's making sure that they match up. And I think when those, you know, there's a lot of big fancy words that go around in this world and a lot of trending words and a lot of things. And for us, it's as simple as helping arrange a team to keep on doing the work that they're doing, and what do they need to make sure that they can keep doing is happening. Because climate change has already come to the desert. We're already dealing with it. We've been dealing with it for a long time now. So we know what we need to keep doing the work we do to make us more resilient, to keep doing the work that we need to do. So the irony isn't lost on us, Desert Mob, that ironically we are the least contributors to climate change, and in the middle of Australia, the most impacted. So that is the irony in that, but it's just making sure funding is aligned and it comes out and it reaches to people on the ground. Sometimes climate finance can come so far, and it sort of lands in that middle ground with facilitative organisations or groups that want to, you know, either advocate or want to hold the money for them. And what you end up finding is that poor ranger team never got the money, you know, or that community never got the money on the ground. So we have to make sure that if you're going to put climate finance as an organisation, or if you're a corporation that want to invest to people on the ground, really making sure doing your due diligence, making sure the money gets to the ground, to the communities. And that comes from having a really open relationship with directly them. So big advocate for making sure that it, you know, it doesn't go through a lot of hoops and different people holding the money and the funding, but you have and build a relationship, even if it takes years, with the groups on the ground. And that's how you'll make sure the money gets to the ground, or else it'll just get lost in all of these organisations in the middle, and it gets super confusing. But for us on the ground, who have gone to the same special site for 40 years, like I have, we see the changes and the impacts, and like I know exactly what I need to make sure to keep caring for that special place. So it's not confusing for us on the ground. It just gets lost in the middle.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go to questions as well next, but I want to pass to Uncle George first. So the question is around, like, what does accountability look like between philanthropy, but also you could also reflect on the approach from government in terms of fund, I guess not government specifically, but the types of funding cycles for government, and what better accountability would look like in that better process.
To be honest with you, I don't really know. Accountability can take so many paths. I can only speak about accountability in our community, which is basically there. You bugger up, you're going to have someone in the back door. It's as simple as that. But the greatest thing about everything is really dreaming. We never thought that we could get to a certain stage. And doesn't matter what anyone else said, don't forget about that dream. It takes longer for your own community to understand what you're talking about. You know, it's such a hard thing to actually put into words. we knew what we wanted to do, but we didn't know how to get there. Joe showed us a way, but we're learning other ways. So now the dream is starting to get steps so that we can actually take it. Where beforehand, I think the hardest part is everyone gets too scared that they're not going to make it. Don't. Just keep on going. It'll come to fruition. It does.
Yeah, I feel like in the conversation and dialogues we've been having on country a lot over the last 9 months particularly, there's a lot of conversation around, I guess, intermediaries coming in, consultants coming in, trying to do that work between philanthropy, trying to do that work between government, and there's a big accountability problem there, but it's the same thing that the money doesn't get down to the ground. But also, I think within that, it's protecting of Indigenous people's knowledges as well, and the commodification of our knowledges is just like the idea that someone's coming in and they're taking this different fire burning tech, saying, well, I'm going to set it up with this ranger group and that sort of stuff, and you see that the funding doesn't come through, things fall over and stuff like that. So I think the investment of a relationship while you're capacity building it. I just want to flag, do you want to commit, all right. Any questions from the floor? Otherwise, I will ask Sam another question. Sam, I just wanted to talk to you about, I want you to touch on a little bit more around, I think the difference between, or in terms of financing around, so like savanna burning, or like you're talking about Spinifex country as well, and just lots of people know about savanna burning and its importance to the climate, but then when Indigenous peoples are managing country, that is maybe seen not as valuable in terms of carbon credits or not established mechanisms around it. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is the diversity of groups that you work with?
I think thanks, Teresa. I think it's about the choice. I think things like the nature repair market and those burning methods, we need to give Indigenous people who are on the ground the choice if that's where they want to go down. I think you take away people's essentially rights if you force them that they have to engage with something that they may not feel comfortable doing. In some of our spaces, they've never had a carbon project in remote areas, and they might not have been engaged in it ever. So when I think about going back home and trying to explain to my aunties and uncles about biodiversity credits, and the first question is, are you saying they're buying Jukurtba dreaming? Because that's the reality. And so you can see if you've never engaged with any of that type of credits or carbon or nature repair market, and you've never engaged with it, and suddenly you've been told that you can do work and someone will pay you for it and buy it at a premium because it's First Nations. That's really intimidating and scary for mob in community. So my big thing is you have to give choice. You can't force people to say, if you're engaging with climate finance and mechanisms that will help hopefully generate, and that will generate money for a lot of good communities that will make good use of it, and that will really empower their work. For me, it's about, again, the choice thing, pushing mob into climate finance mechanisms or markets or ways of spending that money that may not be comfortable, may not be culturally appropriate, may not be the right way, that's the worry for me. That's what I lose sleep over, going, are we going to be forcing groups like my mob, or like Spinifex mob, to suddenly engage with something that they do not want to do or be part of? So it's about choice. And so like going back to climate resilient, a ranger team will know exactly what will make them more climate resilient. Field seasons are shorter because it's hotter. You have to burn is a bit more trickier. So it means okay, when you ask a ranger team, how can we help you be more climate resilient? You'd probably get a response saying, we just want more money for fire and chopper work because we got to do more work in a short amount of time. So this is a practical, mob on the ground ranger teams, we know where the money needs to go. We know it's hotter, its temperatures are harder, wildfires are burning the country crazy. So we need to do the work we need to do in applying fire the right way in a short amount of time, which equates to this much helicopter or saw plane work, which equates to this amount of money, and we need to do double in that short amount of time. That to us is climate resilience. So it's kind of like matching this stream of climate finance and mechanisms and that to, we actually have practical ways to be climate resilient as ranger teams. Just give us the support and let us do that. But when you try and can put this work over on this side here, and or try and fit that in there, it just won't work, and that worries me. That money won't go to the exact plans and strategies that mob have on the ground and ranger teams know that they need. Little things like even giving money to make trips more softer and putting solar panels on ranger bases. Giving that support. So yeah, I think we have practical plans on how to make ourselves more climate resilient. We've been adapting for a long time. Because we've been adapting for the impact's been the most on us. But it's just mixed, getting the climate finance mechanisms and the money over this side and fitting in our world is the issue for us. Yep.
Questions, Kitty?
Well, kia ora koutou. First, just thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, and highlighting the debate about, the real issues about access to finance for our people. I'm from coastal tribes in the North Island on my mother's side and mountain tribes on my father's side. Right now, one of our mountains is on fire and my marae and bones of my people are falling into the water right now. One of the things, I think, Rhys, you mentioned this before, is what it is to be Indigenous communities within colonised countries that are developed. And so there's this hustle to utilise philanthropic funds, try to get it from governments where possible. But what I'm interested in is whether you have any thoughts about whether there needs to be some kind of equivalency of an Article 9.1 provision for Indigenous communities, not an or, but an and, where Indigenous communities can access multilateral funds for adaptation needs.
That sounded like a great suggestion. Not so much a question, sis. That was great.
Do you want to try that one?
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, but what we found out is the majority of time when anything comes up, there's always a solution. As you come into the solution, more people come into it and start learning. This is one of the forums that you can pass those things on. I think the harder part about anything is when you don't see the end, it becomes more hard. But I do know one thing, that the answer is always in the mirror. Every single time we've hit something, the harder it is, the better the outcome. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think I'd just add to that as well. Like, I think as Indigenous peoples globally, we haven't done an enormous amount of advocacy for our brothers and sisters in the global south and developing nations. And we know that the loss and damage, like we know that Australia is one of the largest exporters of fossil fuels. We are absolutely contributing to the problem of climate change and we are making it worse. And Australia does need to play its fair share. It needs to play into the loss and damage fund. But it's not fair to our communities at home to see billions of dollars going into our brothers and sisters in small islands of the Pacific. They need to see that investment from our government. We need to, and I think that to me the piece is like not letting anyone kind of off their obligation, right? This problem was caused by the removal of Indigenous peoples from our land and the commodification of our land under the Industrial Revolution, the profit from a few billionaires around the world. And the reality is, in order to create the solutions to the problem, our communities deserve reparations. And I think for somewhere like Australia, one of the things we've been talking about around the country is that we actually need an adaptation fund. It's not just an adaptation fund for Australia, it's an adaptation fund for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, where the terms of that fund are around adaptation, mitigation and resilience, but also investing in the economies, our new economies, right? Because we're going to, under the climate crisis and the way that we're seeing it, we know that big fossil fuels have to phase out. We know that big agriculture will have to move away from our communities, but that leaves our communities vulnerable as economic deserts. And so what are the economies that need to replace that? And I think we deserve that as well. Like, because otherwise, Indigenous peoples in developed nations become the sacrifice zones for everybody. And I think there's just not enough language around what that actually means, like, and how we're getting financed. So I think we need to have conversations. We're in a really space in terms of critical decade around action on climate. But the other piece of it is, if you continue to go out to our communities and the only investment is money around that, then that's what our communities are going to sign up to, is no other option. And then you're saying, like, well, our communities are just moving on with development. And it's like, well, no, there's no viable option. There are big mining corporations that have been, we've been working in spaces in the Gulf, in the Northern Territory, where, multinational corporations that are, getting out critical minerals are providing dialysis services within community. Like, we need to get rid of that. So I think we need to have a conversation about what we deserve. We don't need just an adaptation fund, and I think we should fight for our own fund. But the other piece of that work is that we actually need to turn to philanthropy and say, let's talk about where the wealth has come from this country. It's stolen wealth. It's money that's been withheld from our country. If you think about, the big four banks, if you think about major corporations, you think about stolen wages, there is billions of dollars, I would say trillions of dollars of our money that has gone to building these corporations that has not come back to our community. So I'm like, how does that money come back? So I do think the obligation of the Australian government and of developed states to our own nations, and to be honest, I think that when Australia pays for its First Nations people to adapt, it will pay into the loss and damage fund. It is the same principle that will determine Australia paying into both. So I guess, sorry, just to go off on a big rant and tangent, but I feel really strongly that we don't have the level of investment, and it needs to be self-determined. Like, it has to be, we don't need another government determined fund or trust. We need our community just being able to access funds on their own terms. I have taken up a lot of time. I'm very sorry. So I just wanted, last question. So just naming, there's a potential that we get COP31, but thinking forward, so we're going to be having this conversation for the next 12 months if we do, but name one practical commitment you believe should begin today to ensure climate finance reaches our communities before COP31.
Making sure we got diversity in the room. There's a lot of times where I travel around and I'm the only person desert connected. So I'm thinking we always got to advocate to have different mob from different country, from different connections and different perspectives in the room. And that applies for the next COP if we end up with it. We have to. We can't. We've got to have. We're a big country. We could have a lot of different mob at the table, contributing to that yarn. And the same with climate finance. When those guiding principles or mechanisms for climate finance coming in, or those funds, or any of those things that come out of this, you got to make sure that you got to have mob from all different perspectives around the table. And it might be harder to engage with people in remote areas or desert areas, but you have to make sure that we collectively have a lot of different mob at the table from all different walks of life, or else we just won't get the breadth of Australia at the table for COP and also for those climate finance conversations, because we need that financial support.
Okay.
Without you repeating the question, I suppose I'd think ahead to the next COP, maybe think of the structural changes that you think about when you actually do think about hosting a party. I mean, it is a conference of parties. And for me, when I think of like the party list, it's like, who's doing the inviting? What's the wording of the invitation? Where's it taking place, and can everybody fit in? Who's going to be there working? How are they included? What's the music? Who's speaking? All those things. And really importantly then, what on earth is going to happen after? Like, where's the accountability when the party is over? And I think that's something that I'm really, really interested about here, is like, we have these great conversations, we meet people, and then we go away. So for me, I'm thinking like, bring on the party theme in the way that we address the structure of COP.
I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I think there's the answer here. Most of the time, the only thing I can think about is accountability. If we're going to say we're going to do something, do it. The government seem to be saying a lot of things, but there's no accountability. And I think the power is right here. I think we should be able to stand up and go, you said this before that, why hasn't it been done? And there should be a forum like this that actually faces that. You're making up all the COP30. You come in and face the people, I think. I think that might be a way of doing that.
Thank you. I think that as we look forward to COP31 within our region, I think we're gonna need to, but it's taking a lot of inspiration from the Indigenous peoples of this region. They came forward with a campaign saying the answer is us. They have had an enormous amount of success in coming together, finding a common platform. And yes, it was a laundry list, but it wasn't a huge laundry list. I mean, it had 5 things on it, and have seen massive investment into their communities, but also lifted up the platform of Indigenous peoples and the work that they're doing here in this region. I just think for us, COP31, I am really excited to showcase our communities, to showcase that we are the answer, that we are leading in so many ways, to understand our unique role within the Asia-Pacific region and the role of the most Indigenous nations and concentration in the world within that space. We are key to the transition. And so what does that look like on our terms? Leading that conversation, I think, is really important. But that means everyone needs to get engaged in this conversation. I think this has been billed as the Indigenous COP, and I think we're going to have an Indigenous COP, but showing people like how we do it, where the investment needs to go, and really getting into the granular conversation around how we do the implementation and just get on with the work as well. I think that's the work that we have to do. So I'm really excited. I'm going to put your hands together for the panel, but thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Larissa.